Oh my goodness, I don't have my light plugged in. Look at that. I'm busy, so busy getting the show started, talking to Jane about the book she has in her parents' house. I didn't even turn on my light. Look at that. I am so, oh my goodness. This is terrible. Now that's much better. People can actually see me. So, hey, welcome everyone to Off the Cuff. And I am excited to have us here today and chatting about all this exciting topic of Darwin. We're going to hit a different topic than we've been on with the race stuff for the last few weeks and all those things that came with that. And I know we're all happy to change topics, not because it's not important, but it is draining and it is exhausting. I actually have stopped. I normally read the news every day. I've taken about 3 or 4 days off of news that I read. I haven't watched news in 5 or 6 years, but I read a lot, but not, I'm just too overwhelmed by all this stuff. And I've taken to other things and working actually on schoolwork and things. So that's where I've been at.
Schoolwork? What do you mean schoolwork? What do you mean schoolwork?
Oh, my PhD. You know very well. I got my hermeneutics, my last class, my last assignment of my last.
You're frozen.
Uh-oh. I think I'm playing.
Not a good day.
Oh, this may be not. I think I'm playing live. See if anybody's watching on this. See if I'm playing live. And see.
You're live. We can hear you. Okay.
So, well, that's good. I posted a comment too, so hopefully, if my wife's watching, she can see that. But no, I mean, yeah. So my last paper for my last class, my PhD, before I start the dissertation writing process, and so just need to get it done, man. Just need to get it done. So I am leaning heavily on Jane to take the entire show today. She is going to step up, and Jane is going to be
step up.
She is going to be really taking the brunt of all of our discussion. Every question today, and I'm sure we'll get thousands, will be directed at Jane. And even if they're not, they will be directed at Jane. So, Merry Christmas to you, Jane.
I'll just be like, I don't know.
No, you can't. I told Jane in the pre-show, I even said, look, here's the deal. Jane is one of these high-class women of apologetics, Biola graduate, MAPA people that have just, Master of Arts, Philosophy, and Apologetics. She is traveled. She went to Ravi's thing in England. She's traveled. She has
I go to England.
I thought you.
I went to Wheaton.
The one at Wheaton.
Oh, that's like England.
It's the same thing. It's still Ravi's thing. That's good enough.
It was Ravi's things, yeah.
In America, though.
It's still Ravi's thing. That's still, you still get the bonus points for that.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's Ravi.
So so Jane has the resume, and I'm expecting her on this issue of Darwin and the failure of Darwinism to explain stuff. She's gonna carry the day. She's gonna and if she doesn't, it is a black eye on Biola and all apologists. And professors and everybody there.
Way to put the pressure on. I mean, that was such a build-up. I'm just going to sit back and watch. It's going to be awesome.
That is no pressure at all for Jane. For you, Leroy, that would be pressure. But for Jane, that's nothing.
It would be pressure for me.
Yeah.
It's very. It's very interesting. There are people who really love like the discussion of Darwinism, right? I mean, it's important. It is thoroughly important, especially when we begin to think about how these ideas begin to work themselves out in public policy, in our relationships together. It's important, but you rarely see people, really try to take it apart anymore. And I think on one level, for some people, they just accept it uncritically. And for other people, they think that the topic is just too hard to understand. So this is going to be a good talk.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope people get some good things out of it. I know we might mention a few books, a few resources. Jane's at her mom and dad's house, and now she has access to all her books, she was saying. So, she'll show a few covers, impress us with.
Grab a book, come back.
Go read it real quick on a break. So yeah, so that's this is it'll be a good, I think, helpful. People give some instruction. By the way, Jane, my wife mentioned, I'll put it up again. I just posted it so people could see it, but you can't. She says Jane rocks. So I'm showing that twice because now you double rock. Just again, more
Nations today too, if you want, you know, like stratas and the Cambrian explosion.
boom. Nice. See, you're going to throw some big words in there. That's all right. We can talk about it. So yeah, I wanted to look at a little bit about just sort of philosophically, what does Darwin try to do? What does it try to explain, and does it do a good job? And then maybe a little bit of some of the scientific challenges that we could say that, okay, Darwinism can't do well with these sort of things. And that's where Jane just mentioned some of the Cambrian explosion stuff, that sort of thing. And then maybe finish with some of the kind of moral, societal challenges that Darwin has presented historically and even presently in our sort of cancel culture attitude that maybe where we're at with Darwinism and where we're going to be, which is really a whole very interesting topic. But I thought I would, I had this actually book that I came across, and I don't know if you guys ever read this. It's called Heretic: One Scientist's Journey from Darwin to Design. And confusingly, maybe this is a knock on the book. It says One Scientist's Journey, but it's written by two authors. Let's see, Matty Lasola and Jonathan Witt. So I think it's Matty Lasola's journey. I've only read a book review on this, but I found a quote that I thought was interesting to start us off with. So it's One Scientist's Journey by two authors. So make of that what you will. Make of that what you will. Here's this quote that he has on this. This is really interesting, and I think this to me explains part of the philosophy of Darwin's philosophy. Actually, maybe before I do this, maybe we should just summarize what is Darwinianism. What do we mean by that? Maybe broadly speaking, and for folks that don't, everyone's studied Darwin and evolution and stuff like that. But maybe one of you guys want to explain before I read this. Just to set the stage. What does Darwin generally say, and how should we understand it as Christians? What should be our attitude as we approach this topic? This is what Jane's.
No.
Jane, this is you. I spent 8 hours studying today for doing a hermeneutics paper. This is all on you today. You are gonna step up. Jane, by the way, has a degree in biology, so she is the most educated person here on the sciencey stuff. So no pressure, but lots of pressure.
So there's three main ideas in Darwinism, and it's basically random mutation, natural selection, and common descent. So those are the main points that Darwin liked to talk about, and everything came from a single cell, and everything got more and more complex. So, that's probably the most basic way you would explain Darwinism.
All right. Well, that's good. Hey, that was good, actually. See, that was, bam, you were on it.
I agree with that. No, I would certainly agree with that, because we try to have a single definition of Darwinism, but what it really is I think the way I heard it explained was methodological naturalism. In other words, by method, we're going to search for naturalistic ideas for origin, for development of or I should say the development of species. The development of species and for how life, not even how life began, but how life, I would say, spread. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that's true. Darwin's whole premise was essentially that, hey, look, if there is no creator God, how did we get here? Well, he needed long epochs and ages of time with basically a certain amount of uniformity, such that, as species and new stuff evolved inside of creatures, that natural selection would say, oh look, hey, there's something useful, and I'm going to pick that in this little critter, and I'm going to make sure that little gene gets transferred onto this little critter, and so that they can become more complex and more advanced and adapt to the different changing environments. But it required millions and billions of years of somewhat uninterrupted evolution for that process to take place, and that's the way it had to happen for him in that process. And that's what gets to what Jane mentioned earlier a little bit about some of those differences that, oh boy, I'm actually watching this online, and I don't know what that was, but it just went off on my phone. So hopefully we're still live. But anyway, so Jay mentioned about the Cambrian explosion and other things where science says, well, maybe it didn't work quite that way, and we get some challenges. But I think, Leroy, your point too is good, that, Darwinism is not just it's not science per se. It's doing science within a worldview, within a framework that says, how did this all happen? And it assumes a naturalistic framework. And so here's the challenge then for Darwinism. And this is where I'll jump in with this book from Heretic. And I'll read this. It says, quote, this is how Darwinism tries to challenge and explain things. It says, evolution is slow and gradual, except when it's fast. It is dynamic and creates huge changes over time, except when it keeps everything the same for millions of years. It explains both extreme complexity and elegant simplicity. It tells us how birds learned to fly and yet also lost their ability. Evolution made cheetahs fast and turtles slow. Some creatures it made big and others small, and some gloriously beautiful and others boringly gray. It forced fish to walk and walking animals to return to the sea. It diverges except when it converges. It produces exquisitely fine-tuned design except when it produces junk. Evolution is random and without direction except when it moves towards a target. Life is under evolution as a cruel battlefield except when it displays altruism. Evolution explains virtues and vice, love and hate, religion and atheism, and it does all this with a growing number of ancillary hypotheses. Modern evolutionary theory is the Rube Goldberg of theoretical constructs. I like that turn of phrase. And what is the result of all this speculative inquiry? Like the defunct theory of phlogiston, I'm not saying it right, it explains everything while explaining nothing well. So, I'm sure you guys have heard those kind of comments and discussions before, but I like the idea that it's the Rube Goldberg of scientific explanations. You guys remember what Rube Goldberg is?
The Rube Goldberg machines.
Yeah, the Rube Goldberg devices. Leroy, do you have a good memory of what those are? An explanation?
We tried to build one here at our house, and they're a little bit more. They may look very interesting, but they're way more complicated to put together than you think.
Yeah. So, I always think about those. If you've ever grown up and you see old Tom and Jerry or, Bugs Bunny type things, those are the machines that, like, you've got this thing, ball rolls down and then it activates a little trigger and that throws up a balloon and the balloon pops and it scares a bird and the bird lays an egg and the egg falls into a pan and the pan is, starts a fire and the fire and the egg pops and the pan flips over when it's done and the egg falls onto a plate. An animal comes and eats the plate. When he does, he goes to the bathroom and then his poo makes, a weight fall on something else. And then this throws a signal up and then all of a sudden a hammer comes and it hits the coyote or it hits Jerry or, something like that.
Something like that.
It's these complex, silly devices that you make to make something simple happen. And I guess that's what, this idea of evolution has become. And I think it's really true. To me, it just seems like it's religion aside, it's sort of this ad hoc system where you started out with Darwin's idea of, like Jane said, natural selection, this idea of things modifying over time and these long epochs. But then eventually, it's like, well, science has said, well, that can't work, and this can't work, and that can't work. So you're like, well, let's just add this idea. And it's just all these ideas and theories added in to make it work. But at some point, have we left the original theory in the dust, and now we're just using a word, evolution, to mean a lot of different theories that don't really explain consistently the same stuff that we observe? I don't know. That's my thought on that. What is your thought, children?
Thought you have there.
What's that?
It's a very random thought you have there.
Random? And evolution explains that randomness of my thought.
It does.
Think of that, or would that just randomly came in your mind and you just said everything?
It's both. Yeah.
But you know what's amazing about it is I think we all have a sense that it doesn't explain everything. But the problem with it is that if you don't have an overarching system like that in place, the converse is something like a god, to explain everything. And people, I think they don't want that. So no matter how complex the argument is that allows people freedom, I think they will do what Thomas Kuhn argued. Even when they find disconfirming evidence, they'll just amend the way that they think to accept the new disconfirming evidence. that's why the theory becomes more and more complex over the years, and it doesn't really explain what it pretends to explain. But what it gives us, if that's what we're looking for, is freedom from God and freedom from believing that there's someone out there that is in control of my life and not, random causes, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like that's really what's holding on to now, that's holding the theory together from the people I read. And Jane, you've done some stuff with Discovery Institute and read some of the, with some of those people, and I think those guys are the ones I've heard argue that, hey, we're in these conferences, we're in there with these science folks, and behind closed doors they're realizing, there's whole conferences in Europe on, we need a new theory of evolution. We need to redo this theory. But publicly, everything still says evolution explains everything. But it's just the word itself is just sort of its own black box, its own. I argue it's sort of like science of the gaps. When you can't explain it, just throw the word evolution at it, and okay, that explains it.
Or just add deep time.
Yeah, just deep time. Evolution.
Millions and billions of years will explain. It's funny how that will explain anything to the mind. Anything can happen over a million and billion years. We were talking earlier about, what'd you call it? The horizontal
gene transfer.
When you said that, I just remembered, the picture where they show the Neanderthal man and Piltdown man and, all Australopithecus all the way to it gets to the human. And it was illustrated to me several years ago that the gaps between these particular phases of evolution are so wide and complex that I think he put it this way. He said, skateboard, tricycle, bicycle, and then combustible motorcycle. He said the gaps between these different stages are more vast than going from a skate to a combustible motorcycle, if that makes sense. It's just that it can't happen. It just can't happen. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and for folks that think that, okay, we're making this up, this is just the Christians like reinterpreting this and not really dealing with the science. I got this quote from Richard Lewontin. He wrote in the New York Review of Books. And so this is this is his quote. So you guys can look this up I'll have it linked on the show after. Folks can see it on the morethancake.org. It'll be on the post of this after on the archive. He says this: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, in other words, claims that we can't validate scientifically, but yet they're quote unquote scientific claims. What he means is philosophical claims, if he was being even more honest. But to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, evolution, Darwinian evolution, is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take this, again, as if science and supernatural are the opposites, not science, not supernaturalism versus materialism. Again, he isn't aware of his own philosophical bias. But anyway, he says, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life in spirit of the tolerance of scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. So we accept it, even though it's just telling these stories that we can't substantiate, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. There, he finally acknowledges it. It's not science versus supernaturalism. It's materialism versus supernaturalism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated.
Yeah.
That is crazy.
It is. I am, the notion of just so stories, and the fact that they fit our already preconceived notions about the way the world functions and the way life begins. This is the area that is always of interest to me, because it really isn't the evidence that is swaying us, because as you said earlier, the evidence is all over the map. What is actually swaying us is our pre-commitment to believing a particular set of facts, and that is where the challenge. I think that's where the challenge lies for us in debates and discussions with people outside of the scientific world who would easily marshal more data than we would probably think about. But when we really have these discussions, it's our already prefigured way of understanding the world, and the stories just fit it. The stories may lack explanatory. They may have explanatory scope or explanatory power. In other words, the notion of deep time extending all the way out and giving us the idea that things can change over millions and billions of years. That kind of fits, what we think the world ought to be. But is the notion of deep time actually even really, true, or do we just accept the fact that it's true? Is the world and the universe millions and billions of years old? Now I know, that I have friends who would readily say, "Well, of course it is," and these are believers. These are people who are committed Christians, but they would not agree with a young Earth or anything like that. So even in the church, I would say that it's an issue for us, a hurdle to overcome, because it just fits the way we think the world ought to work.
So that does bring up the idea of theistic evolution, the idea of did evolution really happen, but it's just guided by God. In other words, all these gaps that the naturalists can't explain, and they just throw out the word natural selection and the word evolution. So that instead of appealing to the science of the gaps, I think, Christians say, well, there's these gaps, and we just say that God intervened or God did this, which I think is actually a God of the gaps argument. But in other words, just sort of throwing the black box of mystery, throwing a name around something we can't explain. But that does bring up the question: where do Christians, where do we fit in this view of what we call evolution versus, certain, especially biological evolution,
Sure.
from lower species to higher species kind of thing. Where do we fit? And so I know, Leroy, and you and I have talked about some of this in the past. Jane, I don't know if we've ever talked about where you fit in this. I mean, I know some of your background, but I don't know if we've ever talked about it. But what do you guys say? How do Christians, how do we approach this idea of evolution? What do we reject it? Do we validate it? Do we syncretize it with our faith? What do you guys say?
Well, the thing is, evolution has so many different definitions. So if we're going to talk unguided process, then I think we would, as Christians, would have a problem with that, because we think God has designed everything and was part of it. So if it's the definition of being unguided, I would say we have a problem.
Yeah. That's a big problem. Yeah, if we're trying to say God's out of the equation at all, like a sort of a deistic God who started things in motion and pulled out and just let it happen. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that one either. I think Jane raises a really good point.
I think many Christians take the approach that the text is authoritative, or in these topics, and then other Christians will take issue with the text and make the argument that this notion of millions and billions of years is embedded within the text. My looking at it, and I'm looking at it right now for a paper on Genesis. I have a particular book by Terry Mortensen, and maybe not Terry Mortensen, but I know one of the guys' name is Uri, who make the case that the genre of the first 11 books of Genesis lead one, especially if one is going to be consistent with the text, to a young Earth perspective. I've also heard people that I respect and admire take a different approach to that. I just think for Christians, I think for us, the first thing that we have to nail down for ourselves is it that the text rules how we're going to see the beginnings of things, or does some other idea that may be foreign to the text rule how we're going to see those things? Does that make sense?
Yeah. We have to decide what's going to be our primary hermeneutic. I mean, do we use the assumption of evolution as the hermeneutic for reinterpreting Genesis and ostensibly even passages in the New Testament, as is done by in the book Adam and the Genome, with McKnight and McKnight, not Swami. I can't think of the guy's name right now, but that essentially takes that approach. And Walton endorsed that. What's that?
Did you say Swami Das?
No, I know it's not Swami Das, but it's Venema. That's what it is. It's a Jonathan name. Jonathan Venema, not Jonathan Swami Das. Venema and McKnight wrote Adam and the Genome, and that's the approach they take is, hey, we know this is a fact. And actually, we have a comment on here, saying, hey, look, a lot of times the problem is professors don't bring up the problems with evolution, so we just assume that it's a problem-free theory. And then you get Christians, I think, who take these things and say, oh, well, it's a problem-free, so we can use this problem-free theory now to explain and reinterpret the scripture. And I think that's problematic too, because the nature of science, by definition, is always changing. Science doesn't give us truth. Science gives us our best effort to understand the external reality that we observe, but it's always subject to change. It's never a final and authoritative. By definition.
That's interesting in and of itself. I mean, how can we say that we have an unassailable and foundation for truth in Scripture, yet rely on? And I'm going to be honest, I'm a younger creationist, so I'm just totally out of the box with that. But I know. But I know.
Off the show.
But I'm not mad at people who don't hold that view. So, and I'm not, I'm more pragmatic in letting other people figure out where they are and deal with where I'm just not trying to make everybody me. But it's just very difficult for me to say that we have this unassailable, foundation of Scripture which we rely on, except in these areas where we can't rely on them. You know what I'm saying? So I'm going to take a textual approach to Scripture and try to interpret it according to the laws of how we interpret Scripture. Literal, grammatical, historical, hermeneutic, and I think that I'm going to arrive at a place where I can be consistent throughout the text. I just think that the people who are making the other argument, I just don't see them as being consistent in the same way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Jane, were you going to say something terrible about Leroy for being a younger Christian guy?
No.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
We all disagree on things and still be brothers.
Exactly. It's an in-house debate. This is such a good point. I remember not too long ago when I first started writing my thesis here, I was, I love William Lane Craig. I'm a Reasonable Faith chapter director. I absolutely, have learned much from William Lane Craig, but I've heard him discuss some of these issues, and I've been troubled by it. But part of me says, I need to discard this guy because, man, he's really messing up. But then the other part of me says, no, he's a brother in Christ. We just disagree here. And then but I go back and forth in my mind because I know that the moment that you allow for ideas like that, they just don't stay contained or compartmentalized. They work themselves out through the text in a way that disrupts the text, in my opinion. So I wrestle back and forth, not because, but I don't take that wrestling out on people. I would never discard William Lane Craig. I met him for the first time last year and I've never been awestruck, but you know me, Joe.
I will discard him. I'll discard him here today on this show.
I'm never awestruck over anybody. And I remember meeting him last year and just being totally without words. And I mean that without words.
He's short.
But he totally is.
This is William Lane Craig. I'm crumbling him up and throwing him.
He's absolutely brilliant. But I wrestle with his views here. But I mean, that's what we have to do. I mean, as thinkers, we have to wrestle with these things, and then we have to find a place to land or remain in doubt until we actually land there. Anyway. That
was me throwing William Lane Craig right at Jane.
I know. I can't do it. I love the guy.
No, I'm just messing. Yeah, I think we do have to have a little more Irenic spirit to some of that stuff. Jane, were you going to say something?
I have all these different, philosophers and Christian apologists that I like, and a lot of them don't agree on a lot of things, and I don't agree on a lot of things. So it's almost like picking and choosing, what you're gonna take from each one. And
I agree.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah, that's why I've decided lately
when I listen to Joe. Okay. When I listen to Joe, I just pick and choose whatever. Every other word is what I'm going to agree with, but the other word,
you and my wife,
not this Joe guy. You were saying, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's okay. That's all right. You interrupted me. Just like my wife. See, you are. You pick and choose and you interrupt me. It is just like my home. Why do I come on this show? Anyway.
I wonder.
You even have a show.
I know, right? Why am I doing this at all? So, yeah. No, I was just going to say, I stay sort of agnostic about the time and the age right now. And I see my wife says, yep. Meaning, yep, you interrupt just like she does, and you only listen to every other word. See, she acknowledges it. There, I approve. That's probably not what she was saying yep to, but I'm going to assume that's what it was, and that's what I do. But anyway, but no, it's just, the case I'm making for my studies, that I think the historic doctrine of Adam and Eve, the reality of those two as being the first human beings, I think is critical. I think young Earth and old Earth people agree on that point. And my argument is ultimately that is the best foundation for both rejecting racism and for racial reconciliation over anything in theistic evolution or evolution as a materialist proposition could ever marshal in terms of coherence. But in making that, so I don't, the age of the Earth, I think science doesn't do a great job of telling us about the age, and I don't think the Bible does a great job of telling us about the actual age. I think there's arguments on both sides, and it just doesn't seem to me to be it seems to be more of a secondary, maybe third-ary doctrine,
Tertiary.
Yeah.
What is that?
The word is tertiary.
Yes.
That sounds like tush, though, so I didn't want to say that because I was like tushiary or something. Like
what's very interesting is we're talking about how, and we are pointing out some inconsistencies in our own in-house discussions, but those inconsistencies are also on the evolution side as well. Yeah. I think the inconsistencies arrive when they get worked out in the real world. I was going to bring up Michael Roos. Who is kind of right in this area. He wrote a blog post on his reflections on the coronavirus. And what was very interesting was his point. He starts off by saying that he has a disease that had he been born years earlier and had the disease a decade earlier, he would have died from. But he is not dying from it. He's got medication that is helping him live. He's got a good job, that during the coronavirus, he doesn't have to go into work. He can, stay at home and work. He's got a wife. He's got grandkids. He's got everything in the world that he wants. He's got his retirement squared away. But then he juxtaposes that against those people who are suffering in the midst of the pandemic, whose jobs went away and who don't have food to pay for, to have money to pay for their food or their other basic subsistencies, and who are really struggling. And he asked a very pertinent question, and he says, my question is, how do you strike a balance? My well-being, because he's older and he's afraid of catching coronavirus, against the well-being of so many of my fellow citizens. And then he laments that obviously no one wants to open up plants where people are going to get sick, and we all need to practice social distance. And he asked, what is it that philosophers, particularly evolutionary ethicists, what is it that we ought to do right now? He said, after all, morality is our subject matter. This is what we deal in, is morality. Now, any person who understands evolution would wonder, that's a very curious word coming out of your mouth, morality. That has a specific meaning and entails some moral laws, which you, by very definition, disagree with. But he says philosophers have answered these questions two ways. They use the Kantian way and say that you should treat people as ends in and of themselves, so you have a moral obligation to help the old and the sick. Other philosophers talk about it the utilitarian way, where they says happiness is all important, and if a few geriatric philosophers like Michael Ruse died, then you have to go to the crematorium. So be it. And he argues that there is no right answer to these questions. There's no right answer. And he says, and he concludes that morality works just fine for everyday issues. Taking a casserole over to my sick neighbor, but when we have unexpected or extreme cases, when our ideas get tested at the margins, morality simply breaks down and doesn't work. And natural selection doesn't usually fine-tune adaptations. And this is a case in point. And his point is, he ends it just by saying, we just have to hope and muddle through it. I mean, isn't that wonderful? I mean, he's arguing that he's not even being a consistent Darwinist in that position. He's not even being a consistent Darwinist. The right answer is survival of the fittest. I mean, you just need to deal with it. You're going to die. But I think because he feels the weight of saying survival of the fittest, that would necessarily X him out. That means that we should open up everything and let people die. And even in his mind, he doesn't have, I don't want to say this, but I might as well, he doesn't have the guts to deal with the outworking of his own philosophy here. You know, so we aren't the only ones who, are wrestling with issues. They're wrestling with issues as well. And their wrestling is at the outworking, the ground level of whether these ideas. So it's very fascinating to me.
Jane, jump in and respond to what Leroy's saying, because I'm too busy using the laughing emoji at him on my phone when I'm watching this, and like laughing and just putting in laughing things. And then I did a couple angry ones, and I did a couple love ones though too, Leroy, just to balance it out. But anyway, there's like 5,000 of those like laughing emojis at your comments right now, but all of those I'm pretty sure are from me. So if anybody's watching, that was me. But anyway, Jane, what we're gonna say.
Yeah, it's basically just listening to that. It's like they don't want to commit to their worldview of Darwinism.
Right.
Like, this is the harsh reality if you really follow the implications of the worldview you subscribe to. And yeah, it's survival of the fittest. That's basically what it is. So like, you let it just go and people are just going to die. I mean, that's pretty much what, survival of the fittest is like the best survive. And in this situation with coronavirus, people who are going to die are the weakest people.
That's right. And guess what? It has been old people, who have died. He called, in this article, he called the old nursing homes the death camps, is what he called them. He called them death camps. But to me, and this is the part that is very interesting to me. On one level, they spend so much time trying to look at every nuance in the gene pool and biology to explain Darwinism and to say that this is true, right? So let's grant, for the sake of argument, that what they said and what they found in evolution is true. What is the outworking of that? The outworking of that is when it works out on the ground, we need to let the weak die. So ultimately, if his findings are true, then he should have the logical consistency, to live out those findings and say, well, hey, it's time to hit the crematorium, as he said in his article. But we don't see our lives that way, and we don't fashion reality that way. That's why bringing up a Kantian solution, even if you were to go with a Kantian solution, on his view, that's just that's like your opinion. That's like whether you want salt or pepper on your hamburger. It's just the way you choose to see the world, that you want to do what's best for people. But on the Darwinian view, there's no right. That's not right or wrong. It's just what you choose. In the same way, on the utilitarian view, where we let the weak die and the strong live, on Darwinianism, that's not right or wrong. It's just what the point just is what we choose. So the whole thing, I think our moral intuition tells us that we should probably not listen. We should argue with them, but we should not listen to the way they biologically construe the world, because if it were just the way that they explained, then in reality it would work the way that they explain that it ought to work, but it doesn't. We see a major incongruity in how they describe the world and how the world really is.
Yeah, I think that challenge is pretty insurmountable for the materialist Darwinist viewpoint, for sure. And I think the challenge to Christians who try to syncretize Darwinism with our faith is that it sort of becomes this ad hoc thing. You're buying into a system, but you have to make an appeal to outside that for those things. The system itself doesn't actually answer anything. So in other words, you end up with a scientific worldview that is incompatible with your Christian worldview. You just choose to value Christianity at some level above it to give the moral thing. But then you're dealing with, these two things that exist at odds. And we don't have to do that. Biblical creation, the idea of that, whether it's young or old earth, can say, look, God can create everything in its kinds and all these other things, but the idea of change over time, that genetically things modify over time periods to self-regulation, to the environment and all these other sort of things. There's nothing that's unbiblical about that. The Christian, the idea, in other words, the part of evolutionary science that is pretty much not argued by anybody, young earth creationists, old earth creationists, Christians of all stripes. I mean, there's always somebody's going to argue with something, but the majority today don't deny that there is such a thing as change over time, that don't deny that there's genetic modification,
adaptation,
that things adapt, that species, go. But usually what we'd say is that anything above the genus or most likely family level, you just can't find it in the record. And that's where the Darwinist, materialist committed person say, well, we see it in these lower levels, below genus and family. Therefore, this is clearly what must have happened, at these higher levels of the taxonomy. But that's the thing, is there's no evidence for it, but they say it must have happened. There must have been over billions of years. This certainly must have happened. And we can come up with these just so stories that explain it. But there you're left with this thing. So for Christians to buy into that above that and deny that God created each of his own kind and all these sort of things, you end up with these two systems at odds. And then we're saying, well, I'm making moral appeals, but what do you do when they don't match? And too often than not, what happens usually is what gives way is the Bible. Historically, that's the case in my study of what happens, and that's the saddest part about it.
Yeah, because you want to respect people, and I do, and you want to listen to people. I just remember sitting in a class, and this really came home for me when I asked one of our professors, why is it that the Bible is the first one to go? And this professor said, and he's talking about professors here in particular, he said, Leroy, they love their tea parties. And
was that an attempt at an accent or something, Leroy? What was that?
It was an attempt at an accent.
Terrible. It sounded like you were having a fit or something.
Yeah, I know. But
don't do that again.
They love their tea parties. He says, Leroy.
No, don't do it again.
No, please. They love their tea parties. No, do it again.
No, don't, please. Never do that again.
Okay. But
you're losing respect. I see it online. Look, there's all these angry emojis coming up right now.
He said it in that accent. And I looked at him cross-eyed like, what do you mean they love their tea parties? And his point was that if they came to some universities preaching some of the things that they preached or saying some of the things that they said, they wouldn't be invited on the tea party circuit in those universities. And they want to be invited on those universities. So they will trade. And he's the first person I heard say that. But I've read it in several books and have just been shocked that people would trade respectability for the truth. And I'm talking believers. And he literally said Leroy. So,
no, please don't ever have him literally say that again. Look, there's more people laughing at you with those laughing emojis and angry emojis. They're just
and I hope
flying
he's
in.
listening because he's one of my favorite people, and that's exactly how he says my name.
And there's a couple sick emojis going up right now too. Like, I don't know who's doing that, but I think there's about 75 in the last 3 seconds.
I know, but he literally said that. He literally said it that way. But
all right, now Jane, bail us out here. Tell us something so Leroy doesn't have to repeat himself again. This is getting painful.
Okay.
This is just so hilarious. I'm just like laughing over here. What were we talking about? I just keep on hearing Leroy.
Well, I mean, address that idea of the moral issue that comes up. I mean, how do Christians reconcile that? Yeah.
Well, we live in this world, and Christians want to be respected, and they want to be seen as intellectuals, and sometimes they give up the most important parts of them to be part of certain circles. And you see it happen all the time. I mean, look at our universities that started off as Christians and Christian schools to teach missionaries and pastors and lay people about like scripture. And I mean, they're the Ivy Leagues, and they're no longer Christian schools anymore. So it's just like history repeats itself. And so this happens with people too. Yeah,
you're right. Though we're seeing that today. I mean, look where where Harvard, Yale, all those places started as founded on these universities for Christian thought, and where they are today, being anti-Christian in so many things. And then you name the university today. In many cases, and I won't, just because it's not. I don't want to start a unnecessary fight here, but you could name any handful of Christian universities today that are moving that same direction, because if they don't, they'll lose funding from the state, they'll lose federal funding, they'll lose all the respectability for their faculty, and it's no longer about transmission of the truth and of the gospel. It's about staying respectable and staying in power, which is a sad thing. But let me mention too, transition Leroy's thought is, this is where, to tie this specifically to Darwin, because this has been a lot of where I've studied the last bunch of years. I read this article by a guy named Noah Carl, and he's like, I'm a sociologist who got canceled. He's talking about the cancel culture. Everybody tweets something from 7 years ago and they get fired and all this other kind of some crazy stuff. Some of it, honestly, maybe justifiable. I've seen some of these tweets that people have made that are really, truly horrific. And I'm like, okay, how was that not a big deal 7 years ago or 5 years ago? But other stuff, I can't
People
even make
weren't
sense.
on Twitter.
Yeah,
They weren't on Twitter. That's what it was.
But this guy got canceled. I don't even know why. But he said, I fear Charles Darwin might not survive the purge of science and history, which actually I don't think he should. I mean, my argument is that, look, Darwin's theory, racism existed long before Darwin was around. It's in the heart of man. Racism in the United States was, the deprecation of non-whites, of black people in the United States, was clearly there for many, 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 many years before Darwin took over. But what Darwin's theory did is it gave a license, it gave scientific justification for to institutionalize racism within our system, whereas before it was just a matter of culture and preference, north and south. But all of a sudden he comes in with his science, and he even knew that this was a possibility. He recognized it in his writings, and he didn't necessarily want it to happen, but he recognized, hey, look, someday the superior white races are going to eliminate the inferior black races, and that's just the nature of things. I may not like it, but that's just the way it's going to go. And so then you get this things where, everyone says, oh, well, Darwin is different. His scientific theory is different than what happened with, eugenics in the early 20th century. But it's really not. Darwin's cousin Galton was the guy who coined the term eugenics and started that in England. But 4 of Darwin's sons became leaders in the eugenics movement. One of his sons took over after Galton. So this article that I have, and I'll post it after, mentions how Galton is going to get canceled, like taking off the names of all these universities in the UK and stuff like that for his eugenics. But what about Darwin's son who took after him? What about the fact that they all derived their theories from Darwin himself and his ideas of the lower grades of humanity based on these features of, phenotypical features of skin color or skull shape and all those sort of things. So to be quite honest, I think we should cancel Darwin, not because it's a reactionary sort of knee-jerk thing, but because I think the theory itself, all it did was, in my view, I mean, this is what I've been studying. I mean, I'm trying to make sure I can say this in an academic language, but I'm not in an academic circle now, so I say what I want. But I do think it fostered that, and I think when we talk about institutionalized racism, I think you have to point right at Darwin's theory itself as one of the strongest factors for so many of the the Jim Crow laws. All of that stuff was based on Darwin's theory.
See, that's what we should do, is we should step into the void and start making that argument really loud. It would be sad to see Darwin go without being taken down intellectually.
Yeah,
it
that's
would be sad.
Yeah.
It would be sad to see it go because it was tossed out amongst other books that were burned, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
But let me say, I wouldn't mourn it if it left, but I would much rather see it taken down intellectually, because I think that's what needs to happen in order for people to make a good change away from it. Because all you've done is you've pushed their beliefs underground. They're not going to not hold Darwin. They're just going to, push it down and not talk about holding Darwin.
And it's not like you have to go find a tweet that Darwin did. I mean, he has a book called The Descent of Man. The Descent of Man. You can just go in there and read what he wrote. It's all in there. I remember the first time reading, I was like, whoa, this is really racist. But like when we talk about the theory of evolution, we never really talk about the stuff that he wrote in The Descent of Man. So it's like people just want to pick and choose. There you go again. So like if people were really to look at like all of Darwin's work, I'm sure a lot of people would be really mad to see what he had to say about.
We should throw it out there.
He called them savages.
Go ahead,
And the lower man, and like he talked about how white people were better. So it's like we really want to talk about white supremacy and racism. Go read Darwin's book, The Descent of Man.
Yeah, he was opposed to the system of slavery. I'll give him that. He thought it was appalling. But at the same time, he referred to when a white person would, have sex and have a baby with a black person, he referred to those children as mongrel races. He had no trouble trading in that language. And I got a comment here that I do a presentation. I talk about this stuff, and we have some people watch that on different occasions have heard some of those, and I am trying to speak on some of this stuff, but not in a way that the world is canceling. I want to cancel Darwin based on his ideas being rejected, not simply because he was racist and his ideas institutionalized racism.
We want to see him gone.
Yeah, but I want it done based on the crappiness of his ideas, and that's a very technical academic word I use there. Sorry to throw that at you.
But you know what's fascinating about that is, and Jane has a ton of books on the shelf. Like I like Darwin's Black Box by Behe.
Here we go.
There we go. I love that book.
You're like Vanna White over there, Jane. That's nice.
Okay.
I like that.
But Behe is taking down Darwin.
Oh yeah.
Michael Behe, his work is taking down Darwin. He is knocking it out by the pillars. But as good as his work is, people don't want to hear him.
Yeah.
Because as we talked about, they have a preconceived notion, a methodological perspective that will not allow any attacks on Darwin.
Yeah. Can I say this is actually part of the reason I chose? So my entire PhD thesis, like I mentioned before, my whole focus is, I believe Adam and Eve provide the foundation for the most coherent argument against racism and for racial reconciliation. And what I'm arguing against in all my chapters and some of the presentations I do now and where I go and do talks on this stuff is that, the alternative being Darwin's thing, some of what he wrote, all the stuff we're talking about, this is tragic. And the reason I picked that angle as an ethics guy is that I thought, if I can, we do live in a culture where we're very sensitive about race and racial issues. And so if we could, as Christians, use that issue to leverage and get our foothold into the door on the evolution discussion, because I think young people are willing to say, wait a second, Darwin was this? Maybe I do need to rethink his theories. Now, some people will just react and say, oh, he's, the cancel the culture without ever thinking about it. But I think that there's a significant number, especially of believers even, willing to say, wait a second, if that's what the theory is, and if it leads to that, if there's logical coherence to that, to racism within that, if it led to the New Deal with FDR, which was a scientific way of expanding segregation in our cities because we could no longer force blacks into a certain thing, so we did it through kindness, which is a whole other topic, then maybe that gets an inroad for people to hear the gospel and to hear the scripture on this, and why that the Bible has a much better answer to these problems than anything they're going to hear from the world. So I do think there's opportunity here in what we're talking about, and I think if Christians can learn to some of these things we're talking about in their dialogues and discussions, they will be helped in these turbulent times.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of these guys that are like trying to show the flaws of Darwin are usually written off really fast. But there's a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, and he actually started reading a lot of the ID proponents because he saw there was problems with Darwinism, and he's like, well, if I didn't find these guys, like, I wouldn't be able to see what other flaws there was with like the theory. So we need more people who are really like searching for the evidence and are willing to other viewpoints, because I think at the university, I mean, there's really just one viewpoint, and it's evolution.
Yeah. I'm always reminded of a Wham Lane quoting Thomas Nagel, and he said something to the effect, he says, I'm most troubled that some of the smartest friends that I have believe in God. And then he goes forward and says, I don't want there to be a God. I don't want to live in a universe like that. And that in a nutshell kind of sums up the attitude that I think it's not that complicated. I know that the ideas, in my opinion, are meant to complicate the real issue. The ideas that we're wrestling with and trying to quantify and tear down, by reproducing thousands and thousands of flies to show that mutations are definitely deleterious to the insect. All that's wonderful, but I think it all boils down to that people don't want there to be a God, and this is the best evidence that they can muster to prove that there isn't one.
Yeah.
And Miss Nagel's very honest of saying, "Hey, I have a cosmic authority problem. I just really don't want God to exist." But he also acknowledges that there are problems with the Darwinian paradigm. So
hey, so we're just a few minutes out from the end, believe it or not, from the end of our show, and talking about this and the challenges within Darwin's we never got into a lot of the sciencey things. I know Jane was going to drop some knowledge on the Cambrian explosion. She was going to go crazy on epigenetics and horizontal gene transfer.
Here, people can read Darwin's Doubt, and he talks about the problems with the Cambrian explosion in there. So, you readers out there, highly recommend this book. That's right here.
Yeah, there's a large, I think it's like 1,000 pages, the book Theistic Evolution that's out. It's got three main sections of philosophy. One section deals with the science, anywhere from anthropology to the actual genetics of stuff. And then third section dealing with either historical, I can't remember, maybe the moral things. I'm just trying to blank in the third section. There's like 1,000 pages, I think, that book. And it is significant with a lot of weighty people who have come in on that. Also worth a read. It's a great reference book. You're not going to read the whole thing straight through like I did. No, just kidding. But chapters are good for referencing some of these topics if folks want to look at that as well. So also, last thing I'll mention too is that on Wednesday, this is really cool. So we discussed eugenics today and some of that stuff. So on Wednesday, I'm actually doing an interview with Richard Rycart. Richard was kind enough to come on the show. He's written multiple books on Darwin. He studied in Europe, and he studied Nazi stuff and in Germany. So that was his like PhD stuff, and he's a brilliant dude. But he wrote a book From Darwin to Hitler, back in the day, and then he's did Hitler's Religion and Hitler's Ethic. But now he's working
I have
on
that book.
Yeah, his books are good. And so now he's doing a book that's coming out, I think, next year on the American sort of historical side of eugenics in America. And that's a lot of what I've been studying the last several years, and tangentially to a lot of my PhD work. So I'm going to have him on the show. That's going to be a great conversation with him to kind of make some of these ties that people like, we just think that, it's just, when you first hear people talking about Darwin and eugenics, it just sounds like, Christians are making this stuff up just because they hate, science, and, they love Jesus so much they are stupid. But if you look at the evidence of this stuff, it is real and it's serious. And I didn't believe it until I started to really study it years ago. Like, I didn't make that connection. I'm like, I just bought the kind of standard line. So it'll be a good conversation, and I'm looking forward to chatting with him. So I know Jane, mentioned you're doing a bunch of stuff. You're doing some shows now. Jane is a super mega star on the internet.
Because I have videos now.
Yes. You have how many now?
I think I have 5, but like 2 really long ones.
Boom.
So,
5 videos, 2 long ones. I'll count those in, like each of those worth 7. So that's like a lot. And you have like a bazillion subscribers on your first month of YouTube. So that's like awesome.
Ooh, awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
If you like to subscribe, Joe will link you to my page.
Yes, I will link you to her page. Yes. And so do you have a website yet, Jane? We got to figure something out about that.
No website. I just have a YouTube channel.
Okay.
I blog years ago, but there's nothing on it, so I don't even want to tell people about that.
Yeah. So right now, if you go to YouTube and type in Jane Pantig for YouTube, actually everybody else's page comes up except for hers. Unfortunately, we're going to resolve that. I'm going to work with you to help that get resolved, because a couple of our videos on this show are now showing up there as well. So at least you're getting exposure, but we want to get your channel up there. We'll do that. So Jane is doing it. She's getting out there. It's fun to see. Glad you do that. So we'll try to link to some of that stuff on the post-show deal and some other things. Leroy, anything you're working on that we should be aware of outside of this? I know you're finishing your school.
That I'm supposed to do a podcast this week with Wintry Night and another gentleman, 2 other gentlemen. So we'll see what happens.
Did you say
Wintry Night? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I know him.
Yes. I'm
That's his name.
Something. That's his blog. That's his blog name.
Oh, okay.
It's cool name.
It's his cool name. It's going to be very interesting.
It's not as cool as More Than Cake, but okay, whatever.
No, nothing is as cool as
you know what. You know what? Hey, can I give you a nickname, Leroy? I think we've talked about this before. I want to give you a nickname right now.
Leroy?
No, please not. Oh God, no. I think we're gonna call you now. Like, okay, you know how Kobe was like the Black Mamba? We're gonna call you.
He's about to get into trouble.
No, we're gonna call you. We're gonna call you the Black Unicorn, because you are one of a kind. Because, like, not only are you, like, a rare species of whatever, you're, like, rarities among rarities. You are just, you are a black man who's a conservative. You're a black man who is, like, got a bazillion degrees and all your study. You are a young earth creationist, which right there, that puts you, like, there's 7 of those around.
I know.
So we'll talk about that. That might be a good nickname for you. We're going to vote on that. So everybody watching, vote on that. If that would be good. We could have a whole website called that and stuff. You and Winter.
I know.
Tonight on Wintry Nights, I talked to the Black Unicorn.
Yes. No.
And little children love unicorns, so you'd be beloved by children everywhere.
You'd be loved by children everywhere.
Yeah.
Boy, that's a very interesting. Yeah, no, it won't work. No.
He's like, oh, hell no.
No. Okay, well, you can come up with that. So I'm going to start. Look, first of all, you've never replaced your guy below with the new cartoon Leroy. I think he intentionally doesn't replace it so he can complain about it all the time.
I have that one done.
I know. Been saying that for a month now.
Mm-hmm.
Never give it to me. You just complain about the one I made.
I'm going to send it to you.
I'm going to put a picture next week. I'm going to put a picture of a unicorn on this page. I'm going to put a little horn on it.
Oh, that would be awful.
I'm going to do that. Actually, I'm going to.
You know what? You know what's really interesting though.
I'm gonna seriously. If you don't have it to me next week, you're gonna wait till you see what's on that below on that lower third, dude. No, I've got it in my head right now. It is awesome.
What is very interesting is to occupy that space, though, to not be like everybody else is, and there's a lot of drama that comes with that. Man, I get hate mail. I mean, believe it or not, people actually send me. I'm glad my wife never sees it, but they actually send me hate mail. I've had people that I've known for decades send me messages and are just ridiculous. And I've just made a decision that I don't care. You know what I mean? I don't care. I think that what I have to say is true. I think that what I have to say is somewhat critical in some areas, but I think that is true. And I don't care that people are offended by it, because you're going to be offended by something. You might as well just add me to your list.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we have to have a worldview that values everybody, not based on their, they have a minority opinion, or that they have a skin color that's different, or they're, missing an arm or a leg, or whether they're gay or straight or whatever. We have to have a worldview that says all of us are sacred. Yes, there's questions of morality that we deal with, but those morality is a separate issue than sacredness. And all of us,
we don't have to agree. We don't have to agree. We don't have to. We can let everybody be free. I think if everyone has to agree, then our whole notion of freedom is out of the door.
Yeah.
It's out of the door. Now, what we should do is we should test each other's ideas. I think that's what people who respect each other do, is we listen to each other. We test the ideas, and then hold on to what's true and hold on to what's good. I think that's the best thing that we can do as citizens of our country. In other words, even with non-believers, we can be that way. We don't have to be rude or offensive to non-believers. I think with fellow believers, then we really ought to extend the charity of listening to each other intently over a long period of time, and giving the other person who you disagree with the opportunity over and over and over if they should choose, to explain their level of disagreement and why they disagree. Because that's what people who are going to spend eternity with each other do. We have to respect each other. And you're right, though, when you talk about being out in a space by yourself. I mean, there's not very many. And those who are out there really don't want to say anything, because you can get canceled today. You can get canceled for saying things. So
I know we're long, but I was just curious to ask, since we're right here. Jane, do you ever feel that way in terms of where you're at as either a woman, or as in just even a Christian, or I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's the same for you, or so. I mean, I sometimes feel like I'm out in the middle of nowhere these days. I felt depressed for a day this week. I just felt like, why am I even fighting some of these fights with going on? I seriously was ready to just delete my site, and I'm not kidding either. I was just really depressed for a day. That's why I had to stop reading the news. It's just so overwhelming. I don't know. Where do you feel about that, Jane? Where do you feel? How do you see yourself fitting into the bigger Christian world, or I don't know?
Speaking truth is some things like people don't want to hear, and just have to be ready for it. And it's scary out there right now. Just literal on Instagram. One of my friends just sent me something that one of my other friends had said to her, and I was just like, what is going on here? Because she had said something, and they're like, well, this is not the time to be saying this because these things matter more. And another friend's like, I could care about all of the things at the same time.
Yeah.
So trying to make us pick and choose what's most important in this time. And so a lot of things matter. We don't stop thinking about other things because there's other things that are coming up. But for my friend to attack my other friend, and it's just all over the internet, and I don't even want to be on Facebook. I don't want to be on Instagram. It's just not a nice place right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where we can just be praying for one another. And, just even doing this show, I know, like I said, Leroy takes heat a lot for a lot of the things we discuss. And I'm sure, that it doesn't get easier moving forward, but I'm just thankful to have you guys kind of stepping through this and knowing that there's people that you're not alone completely in all these things, and even in these discussions is really helpful. So anyway, we're long, but I appreciate everyone. Hey, we'll have this uploaded to YouTube after, and I will get the archives put on the blog, morethancake.org, as soon as I can. And we will hope to see you all next week. Oh, tune in Wednesday, too, for my thing with Richard Rycart. But the three of us should be around next Saturday as well, as far as I know. So we'll see you there. Take care, everyone.